Hello, everybody. Hello, hello. Look at you all. Nice and prompt. Thank you so much for giving us your lunch today. Welcome. Come on in. Come on into this virtual room. This is always the strangest part of hosting these webinars because I can't see any of you and I have no idea if you like any of my jokes. So please send me an email afterwards if you do. By the way, I'm Jen. I'm the Executive Director of sf.citi. Thank you for joining today's policy chat. This is our second policy chat in our COVID-19 effect series. We're going to be looking at all kinds of different issues and how they are going to be affected by this crazy pandemic that we're currently in. Today, we've got a great conversation with SF Planning Director Rich Hillis. He is going to be speaking with us about the current state and outlook of San Francisco's office market. Yeah, so it's going to be an interesting one. I bet there's a ton of work from home people right now wondering when they're going to be getting back to work, if they ever do. So I'm going to go through a few quick housekeeping notes, and then we're going to cover a couple quick slides on today's conversation. First off, you see down below, oh, I see there's Q&A filling up already. Awesome. You guys are all expert Zoomers. So for today, if you have a question that you want to ask Rich or myself, please fill it out down there in the Q&A button. We have a big section of today's conversation that's going to be dedicated specifically to answering your questions. Thank you to those that submitted their questions ahead of time. We're also going to hopefully get to all of those. This webinar is being recorded. If you miss some sort of really juicy detail, don't worry. You can rewatch this thing as many times as you want. It's going to be sent out to you afterwards. Lastly, if you want to share your thoughts about today's discussion, you can use the hashtag the COVID-19 effect and tag sf.citi. sf.citi. There you go. Awesome. Okay. Well, without further ado, I'm going to quickly go through an overview of today's conversation, and then we are going to bring up Mr. Hillis himself. I hope everybody can see this. This is always the fun part where we have to pull up and share our screens. Okay. So, who is SF.citi? We are San Francisco's Tech Trade Association. We were founded back in 2012, which seems like a lifetime ago, after a few years after the last recession. And so our job is to empower San Francisco's tech community to have a voice. But really what it means is we get to have awesome conversations like this, where we bring together community leaders to talk about how we can be building a better San Francisco. All right. Okay. I also want to let you know that we have a COVID-19 update. So SF.citi every Monday releases an email, and it gives you all the resources from San Francisco's tech community, all the updates from the city of San Francisco, all the updates from the state of California, and the many, many ways where you can help. And I would love TLDRs. I don't know if you guys are a fan, but I think it's awesome when somebody is able to provide me a quick snapshot of something I didn't read. So in case you didn't do your homework, we actually released an entire thought piece on this office space market last week, and I'm going to quickly give you a couple of the highlights. So first off, before COVID-19, San Francisco was the hottest market and the most expensive commercial real estate market in the country. It was pretty much impossible to find office real estate in this city. So much so that most companies were actually inking deals for offices that wouldn't actually be built for years. At $130 per square foot in top buildings, San Francisco rivaled other global metropolitan powerhouses. Although it did fall short of one other major city, that's Hong Kong. That was $322 per square foot. During COVID-19, things changed pretty quickly. If anybody's been downtown, it's pretty much a ghost town. Office occupancy rates fell from about 90% to 10%. Affected tax revenues, well, I mean, we're going to be here forever if I tell you every single one of them, but quickly, I'll just run through. We got property taxes, we got transfer taxes, we've got affordable housing linkage fees, and commercial rent taxes. The city is projecting a $1.2 to $1.7 billion budget shortfall over the next 2 years. Those taxes would come in handy quite a bit right now. Lastly, after COVID-19, the future of work and offices may never go back to normal. It is going to be an interesting time. Some of the things we're looking at right now and we'll talk about today. Sending workers back to the office. Do you only send some workers back? Do you send your entire workforce to a telecommute indefinitely? How do you administer the required temperature and health checkpoints in a safe and non-invasive method? How do you automate cleaning technology? What is physical distancing going to look like in these offices? The majority of our members, which I imagine a lot of you fall into this category, sit about 2 feet apart from their typical coworker. Well, physical distancing guidelines are going to require 6 feet apart. So these offices are going to be changing quite a bit. So these are just a few of the things that we covered in our thought piece. It is going to also be shared in the chat if you didn't get a chance to read it. Highly recommend it, not because we're the ones that wrote it, but it's a really good piece kind of giving you an idea of what you're going to have in store. So it looks like we got a nice full room now. So I'm going to pop back up here. Hello again, everyone. We're going to administer a quick poll, and then I will bring up our featured speaker, Rich Hillis. All right, everybody. And we have our poll launched. We're going to take a couple seconds. Okay, not seeing it. Let's see. We're going to try one more time. Thanks, Zoom. There we go. Now everybody here should be seeing it. Remember, it is anonymous. Don't worry. We're not taking this data for anything. Okay. We're going to leave it up for a few more seconds. Don't forget to vote. Great. We've got almost everybody here in the room. All right. Let's share the results. So overwhelmingly, y'all are ready to get back to the office in June, but it does look like there's a good amount of you that are ready to wait a little bit longer. Okay. I think we are ready to bring up Mr. Hillis. Mr. Hillis, please join us for today's conversation.
How are you? Good to see you.
Hey, Rich, how are you doing?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me. I mean, feeling a little cooped up, but generally okay.
Yeah, I see no kids running around in the background, so you've got somewhat of a spot.
You may see them though. I have 3, 2 in middle
Okay.
school and 1 in elementary school. My wife is working. She's a disaster service worker, so I'm home running the planning department as well as kind of homeschooling 3 kids.
Okay, well, we're happy to see any sort of cameos in the background. That's always a fun part of these Zooms. We've been getting all kinds of fun leaders' kids in the background. So let's get started. How has it been taking over a major department like planning during this pandemic? I think this is the easiest way to start our conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly been a challenge, and obviously not what I expected. When I was hired, I was able to be in the office for actually 1 week before the mayor implemented the shelter-in-place order, and the entire department was kind of asked to work from home. We didn't have an enormous work from home component to the department, so the first month or so was really kind of trying to get the department up and running remotely, in being able to still continue the work we do on behalf of the city from our kitchens and living rooms and whatnot. So that was the initial challenge. And now it's really, what are our priorities? This has shifted a bit, kind of what we're looking at and what we're undertaking. Housing still a critical priority, but as you indicated, kind of what happens to the office market coming out of this? How are our neighborhood commercial corridors affected in small businesses? What do we do to recover from this?
And so how has this changed? I mean, I imagine when you started with this job, you had so many things in mind, especially coming off the planning commission. You probably had a lot of goals. How have they changed since this pandemic?
Well, I think our priorities have expanded in things added to the list. I mean, certainly housing and affordability were the main priorities the mayor had and I had coming into this position. I mean, as we all know, the Bay Area is tremendously expensive. San Francisco is expensive, mostly due to our housing market and trying to figure that out and build more housing and make the region more affordable. So I think the COVID crisis and the health crisis have highlighted that. I mean, it's shown, that we're underhoused dramatically at all income levels. Maybe not at the top tiers, but definitely middle income levels, low income levels. We need more housing at all levels. So I think that's still a priority and the major priority. But what we do coming out of this housing, I mean, office, as you said, was robust. The market was very active in new applications for new office buildings were coming in. Now that's kind of obviously slowed down, if not stopped, in how we respond to that, how we help our small businesses and neighborhood commercial corridors, which we're struggling to, and retail was an issue, and how we fill vacancies in commercial corridors, but that obviously is going to become an even bigger issue as we begin to recover from this crisis.
So let's rewind a few months. When you first kind of got into this role before this pandemic hit, what did the market look like? What did the office market look like? What did the commercial corridors, retail?
Yeah, so the office market, like you indicated, was strong. I mean, I think we were starting to see some slowdown in the office market, but not a huge amount. It was the strongest it's been in years, and we've had almost 8 years of increase in the market and an active office market, both filling existing space and applications for new spaces, which is primarily what the planning department does. As you know, or people may not know, there's a cap on the amount of office space that the city allows every year. This was put in place in the 80s under Prop M, which allowed about 875,000 square feet of new office space every year from the 80s. And if it didn't fill up, it kind of accumulated over the years. And we really have never been since the 80s at a point where we actually needed to start restricting new offices because of those Prop M caps. But we were coming upon that with the economy and the growth in the office market. So we were really going to have to start making choices about what projects could move forward and which couldn't. Prop E has kind of changed that and made it even more restrictive on how much office space could be built. So, the market was strong, and we were talking about kind of what those limitations would do. Would they drive up the cost of office spaces? Would small businesses and nonprofits be forced to leave their offices? So, but I think that's shifted now because there isn't that demand or that the request for new office spaces.
And so what did it look like more at a ground floor level?
At the ground floor level, obviously issues about retail and filling vacancies, the quote unquote Amazon effect we were feeling in commercial corridors, which had difficulty filling vacancies with kind of the typical retail goods type entities. So it was more restaurants and things like that entering into ground floor commercial space. So we were already thinking about how, how we could kind of loosen the regulations about what could be on ground floors, maybe allowing things like nonprofit office space in ground floors along commercial corridors, expanding kind of the uses that were allowed on ground floors. Again, I think that's going to be even more acute now that the health crisis has hit, and we're going to see more vacancies in commercial quarters.
So obviously there was even a vacancy tax that was passed relating to this, and that was a pretty controversial idea for a lot of people. How do you see that playing into the future?
Yeah, obviously not good at this time when
Yeah.
I mean, it was put in to be an incentive for property owners to fill vacant storefronts, and there was debate even at the time whether that would actually do what it was intended to do and help fill vacant storefronts. So obviously, not a great idea to do that and implement that now. So the board is actually they've got the ability to reduce that tax or not charge it, and they've passed an ordinance recently that they're not going to implement that tax now. It's kind of up to them when they'll bring that back and begin assessing that tax. But I think that's the smart move during this is not to implement that tax, obviously, during this time.
So we've heard from some of our other folks in the industry that they're looking at potentially a 15 to 20% commercial real estate downturn in the next year or so. What are you seeing from your perspective, kind of post-pandemic, what the offices are going to look like?
I mean, we're definitely seeing, uncertainty in the market. I think it's a little bit early to tell kind of how big, or how big the impact is going to be from this on future office development. But we're already seeing, like in places in Pier 70, that Google has kind of held off on their desire to lease some of that space. We're seeing that elsewhere throughout the city. So I think we're going to see a pause on new office projects moving forward. I think for two reasons. One, just the financial uncertainty. Are we in a prolonged recession? Can the developers find tenants coming out of this? Can they find tenants now in order to finance the construction of those office buildings? And also kind of what the future of office looks like. Do companies need as much space as they did once before? And kind of what does office space look like coming out of this? So I think those two factors have just thrown a lot of uncertainty into the market, and we're seeing just a pause on new projects, which is, unfortunate. We've relied, because the market was so strong in office, we actually relied on new office to fulfill a lot of the public benefits in plan areas like Central Soma. The new office was funding housing and affordable housing. Things like the parking lot adjacent to the Giant Stadium was going to do a combination of office and housing and affordable housing, really as the office as the economic engine to do a lot of the public benefits, parks, infrastructure, affordable housing. Same with the Potrero power plant down by Pier 70 and Pier 70. So, we've got some concerns. Are those projects still viable if office is not going to be the economic engine behind them?
Are there any other notable ones? I think the one that splashed the headlines that you're referring to, the Alphabet one, that was a big deal. Is there any other notable ones that you've heard of so far?
No, I mean, I know like Oceanwide, which is a large office tower with hotel and residential down by Trans Bay is looking for a buyer. They were talking to folks. Whether that's going through or not during this time, kind of unsure. So, I mean, we're just seeing kind of just uncertainty.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to lead to delay.
In terms of the pause that you're referring to, did we see this in 2008 and other recessions? Is this a common thing for us to go through?
No doubt. Yeah. I mean, I think office tends to be the factor that leads or is most impactful during downturns. I think it happened during the Great Recession, whereas housing, didn't have as big of an impact. I mean, certainly values went down and there was less development happening. But yeah, I think office tends to have the biggest impact when we're in a down period, and kind of the biggest growth when we're on the
Yep.
upside too.
When things are good, offices are
Yeah.
booming.
Yeah.
Yep.
And if you look back, San Francisco has created 6 jobs to every 1 housing unit in the past 8 or so years. So we're creating jobs. Obviously, people have places to work, and we're finding places for them to work. Probably not as great on the side of finding places for them to live, but at the same time, the Bay Area is creating 4 jobs for every 1 housing unit. So it's not just San Francisco; it's the entire region that's kind of had this imbalance, and in office has kind of been driving things.
I think that's a good segue into, this is a crisis, certainly, but in crisis there's opportunity. We had a conversation with Mayor Schaaf last week, and she had all kinds of novel ideas of what they're going to do post-pandemic to improve Oakland based on some of the things that they've learned and been able to try, the slow streets being a big one. Where do you see us changing things post-pandemic? What do you envision for the city? What have we been doing well? What can we improve on? What does this opportunity look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think I go back to kind of housing as a priority. I think it's just an enormous issue that we all face, and we see friends and family and neighbors who can't live in San Francisco, who can't live in the Bay Area because of the cost of housing. And again, I think the crisis has kind of shined a light on this even more so if it wasn't obvious to everybody beforehand. So I think we need to continue to stimulate the housing market and to build more housing and more affordable housing, both as a way to stimulate the economy and get things going, and that may be the link to the crisis, but because we've just vastly underbuilt housing in the city and in the region. I mean, Spur came up with numbers recently that we've underbuilt by some 600,000 units in the past 20 years, which is enormous. And if you look back to decades, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, regionally, we were building twice as much housing as we've done in the past decade or the decade before. So, obviously this has been on everybody's mind, but maybe this crisis can get us over some of the hurdles that we've had in actually, building, allowing for new housing and affordable housing, not just in San Francisco, but in the region, because it's really a regional issue.
So you're the head of the Planning Commission. I mean, you've cut your teeth in this stuff. You know what it looks like when it comes to these permits and zoning. So why haven't we been building?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's many factors. One, it's especially in a city that's already kind of built out and dense like San Francisco, there perhaps aren't a ton of opportunities to build. Definitely when you build, there's impacts on neighboring communities and neighbors. And we kind of have to get beyond that. I mean, we've got to look at things like what Minneapolis is doing and what Oregon is doing in getting rid of single family zoning. Not necessarily not just in San Francisco, but throughout the region. And that's a huge step. I mean, it's part of the American dream, owning a home and having open space. But that's not going to solve our housing crisis, is everybody having a single family home. So continuing to densify the city, doing it smartly, doing it equitably. We've built most of our housing on the eastern side of the city, in south of Market, downtown, along the waterfront. We've got to look to the kind of western side of the city and get more housing built in those areas. But most of that space is built out, so it's difficult to do that. But I think the city leaders have to take that on and get new housing built. I also think there's a problem just regionally. Is I heard it when I was on the Planning Commission. We blamed San Mateo or San Jose for not doing their share, and there's no real regional government or regional leadership. And I think the leaders of the three major cities, ABAG, MTC, have to kind of push to build more housing regionally, because there's no way San Francisco is going to solve this on its own. There's got to be regional solutions. And that's why the state has stepped in, I think, so much in the housing debates, is because they realize kind of that the municipalities in a specific region in San Francisco aren't doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the regional thing is that's a concept we keep hearing over and over again, whether it's, kicking the can down the road, whether it's people down south saying it's San Francisco's job to build housing, and then San Francisco says it's so-and-so's job to build housing. The fact of the matter is we need the housing,
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting point in terms of the workforce. If we're building new housing, but we have somewhere between, on the high end, 90,000 or so tech workers, depending on how you classify it, on the low end, in the mid 70,000s or so. If those workers are shifting remote, is that demand for housing, what is that going to look like? Are we still going to be able to build and fill all those houses?
I think so. I mean, I think, right, there's debate about where this is going. People are just going to return back to offices as normal. I mean, I think the poll kind of showed the variation in thinking on this, or everybody's just going to kind of move to rural areas and work remotely. I still think there's kind of people value being in urban areas. They want to live in cities. There's vibrancy, there's diversity that people want. So there's still, whether we're working remotely or you're working remotely part-time and going into an office part-time, people want to live in urban areas. So that demand, I think, is still going to be there, and we've got to address it by building more housing. I mean, especially if your home is also acting as your office space in the future. We can't stack people on top of each other. We've got to be able to have people, have livable conditions where they're living.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's something we're seeing, depending on the office location. Some of our members with offices in Asia, in Tokyo, they want to get back to work because they build 400 square foot apartments and there's more than one person living in it. And that's something that's really fascinating, is depending on where the office location is, our members are kind of hearing different responses from whether employees want to be working from home or not.
Right.
So I just want to remind everyone that we do have a Q&A below. Please fill out your questions. We will be getting to them soon. And with that, I'd love to jump back to, we mentioned slow streets and use of space before a few of these questions. What sorts of novel ideas are you guys working on right now about how to use this space creatively? What kind of interesting solutions could there be?
Yeah, I mean, definitely along commercial corridors. I mean, if you think of a typical restaurant and how they operate, especially in San Francisco, where you're kind of trying to pack people in, there's not much social distancing there. So can we kind of expand and use some of the public space in order to take that up and allow people to social distance and have more gracious amounts of space? So definitely working with DPW and MTA on how we can grab some of that public realm space, the sidewalk, even encroaching into the parking areas and the street. I mean, similar to what parklets have done in the past, in being able to capture and use that space for some of our small businesses.
Yeah, as soon as I heard about the legislation, the first thing I thought of is the big piazzas in Lisbon, right? This is using these big spaces and alleys for restaurants is so commonplace in other cities, particularly in Europe, yet you don't really see it in places like San Francisco and in the US.
Right. I mean, even parklets, which I think are extremely popular, when a restaurant takes kind of a portion of the parking space and converts it into a kind of open space seating area. Currently, that space, the restaurants can't serve customers in there. They're generally open to the public. Anybody can sit there, and they're prohibited from kind of serving into that space. I think there's a decent policy rationale for that. That's public space. We want it to be open and open to the public. But as we kind of look at the crisis and what's happening and how we come out of that, I mean, I think that's an easy place that the city can make changes in kind of treating that as an expansion of the restaurant or whatever it is, cafe, and allowing them to utilize that space and even beyond. And
That's an interesting point. Now that you mentioned the parklets, I only see people having their takeout that they take to go to sit there. I never realized they're not actually being served.
yeah, and that's city rule and ABC, which is the state that controls alcoholic beverages. They don't want alcohol being served at those. But I think the COVID crisis has made everybody kind of look at those issues and want to resolve them. They were already issues before, but have kind of the momentum to fix those now and help some of our small businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard numbers of at minimum a third in California restaurants will likely never reopen, right, at minimum.
And restaurants are driving kind of what our commercial corridors are looking like. They definitely, where the businesses we're seeing fill vacancies at a higher rate than others. So obviously they're critical, they're job rich, they employ tons of people in restaurants. So, making it easier to continue to operate and even open new restaurants, I think, is going to be critical.
Yeah, one of the things that we've thought a lot about is downtown. If these offices stay vacant much longer than the rest of San Francisco, which, as we're hearing, people are saying go back to work in January or never go back to work. What can we be doing for these downtown spaces, for all those restaurants and all those coffee shops and things that would normally probably have a ton of tech people that are going through on a daily basis? What's going to happen to them where they don't maybe have that kind of space downtown?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to look at that. There's still public realm space that could potentially be used, but also flexibility on how you operate. And there are currently kind of restrictions on restaurants have to serve primarily in-house and can't be takeout unless you're approved for that. But giving flexibility for restaurants and other businesses to change their business models and retool without going through a ton of bureaucracy, I think is going to be key. And the mayor put together, I think you mentioned it, the mayor has put together kind of a task force, a recovery task force with 100 or so people. So it's big, but it's got a big kind of job ahead of it, both to look at how we immediately come out of this, like when can people return to work and what are the rules as you return to work, but also longer term, what fixes can be made, that keep businesses open and keep offices occupied 6 months from now or a year from now or even longer term.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just this huge opportunity to really tackle some of these problems that have piled up for years on end, and we go to City Hall, obviously, we're a trade association, and those small businesses, some of the stories they tell us about permits and zoning, it's, they say San Francisco is the most expensive place to have a small business in America.
Yeah, right. And restaurants kind of get the brunt of it, the amount of process they have to go through, not necessarily just from planning, but TBI and the health department, and it goes on. So, right, the opportunity to kind of fix those issues.
So looking back at the office conversation, obviously we're gonna have to reopen all of these large buildings. Any sort of guidelines that you all are looking at? Obviously the California Department of Health has handed theirs down. What is your office focused on right now?
Yeah, we're less focused on that. I mean, we're primarily new construction of new office space or conversion to office space, but involved in those discussions. And it's definitely something that the Mayor's Task Force is looking at. I mean, I think just like with construction happening now, as construction is kind of being allowed under the orders, we're taking most of our guidance from the health officials, on what's appropriate or what's not appropriate, or how offices need to operate. You need to reduce kind of the census of people who are in an office at one time. I mean, we're facing a similar challenge in that we're slated to move our offices to a new office at Market in Van Ness that the city is building currently. Just kind of questioning, one, do we need all that office space that we had kind of, taken down as part of this? And how are we going to actually operate during that process? So, yeah, I mean, we're in discussions with kind of a broader city family on what that looks like and what the rules are going to be coming out of this. But I think really that the public health officials are going to dictate how that works, or at least set guidelines on kind of how kind of back to work works, which I imagine is going to change, as this continues to unfold.
So one thing I'm pretty curious about in terms of the new offices that are being constructed, have you seen any conversations or even seen people start taking steps to reconfigure how they were designing these buildings because of the pandemic?
Not yet, but there's definitely been conversations amongst architects in those that kind of lay out those spaces on what they look like and what their function is. So I know there's been discussion. Our design team has been part of that, kind of what the next generation of office space looks like. So it's out there. I think it's early yet to say what that's going to look like, but even from our own experience, we discouraged people from working at home and working remotely. A lot of it had to do with the fact that we were a little technologically behind the times, where we were still looking at paper plans in approving permits and whatnot. We're past that at this point. We were even before the crisis. So, this has made us realize we don't necessarily need to be in the office. We can actually provide service to clients and customers easier, almost remotely, if plans are submitted remotely and or electronically, and we're doing this work electronically, we can be more efficient. So, we're in the same boat. It's making us question how we function and how our office functions, and we're having that conversation also broadly.
I think in particular for the tech industry, tech's ethos is so much around creating this environment where people are hanging out and there's tons of space for people to congregate and to stay long hours and cafeterias. And so tech in particular is facing the exact opposite environment that would be created post-pandemic. And, just wondering how this culture will continue to thrive without this setup that is designed for, basically communal purposes.
Yeah, and I think that's why office will continue. I mean, it may be changed, kind of what it looks like, but yeah, every place I've worked, that communal aspect, the collaborative aspect of your work, it's lost when we work remotely and try to do this all through a Zoom call or whatnot. And so, it goes back to why cities are important and why people want to live closer in denser environments. It spurs that creativity. And so, those folks who are saying the office, kind of the way we used to operate it is no longer going to be the case. I think it's going to change, but I don't think it's gone, right? I mean, I think we're going to continue we're going to need that space to be collaborative and be with our coworkers to figure out these issues and solve problems. It's not going to go away. It may look a little different. Yeah.
Well, that I think is a good point to end our chat on and switch to some of our questions, because I see that they are piling up. So I'll just get started. So this one is from an anonymous attendee. Are there any legal basis for commercial tenants asking for rent relief? Is the landlord able to provide such rent relief on their own discretion?
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure I'm the one to give out that advice, but I mean, certainly I think, and we've seen this where landlords and tenants are negotiating those sort of deals in figuring out kind of what relief looks like. We've got in the city rent control for residential units, but there is no rent control or really ordinances surrounding rent for commercial. The state is definitely looking at that and trying to figure out kind of rules that may allow this sort of negotiation to happen or happen easy or give tenants kind of a leg up in those negotiations. But I think that kind of hasn't been fully developed yet. And it seems like it's on a kind of case by case basis.
So on the radar, but not here yet. It seems the theme of this pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of uncertainty in Yeah.
All right. So Jennifer is asking, would it be possible to turn empty office space into housing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a natural direction for this to go if we start, seeing that trend where we're actually we're not building new office space, but we're seeing tremendous amounts of vacancy or larger upticks in vacancy. We've seen that happen. I mean, in the past, where I think as we were coming out during the last recession, office kind of space that was vacant, contemplating more residential uses, or even in new developments, office project kind of shifting to residential. I think we've seen the opposite as the market has shifted over the last 8 years, but I anticipate that we're going to go back to that, both for new development where residential is more stable and perhaps just pencils better, but also could be for existing office space if this gets to that point.
So it is a possibility. There is a zoning journey to go on.
I think most places where office is allowed, residential is also allowed. So from a kind of technical zoning point of view, I don't think that transition is difficult. Sometimes floor plates for office projects aren't quite well designed for residential. They tend to be kind of larger, no light wells or kind of access to exterior light. So that tends to be problematic in converting office space to residential, but it's been done. Like on Van Ness, I think it's 100 Van Ness, which was the old kind of AAA office building next to City Hall, was converted to residential and has been a success.
All right, so we have a bunch more questions that have piled up here. One of them's asking about the city's post-pandemic plan as it relates to open floor plans. So I think we touched on this a little bit, but this person is wondering if there's anything else in regards to use of elevators, cubicles, are they coming back?
Right.
Anything else you could share in terms of those details? Yeah,
again, I think we're also kind of asking I think the health officials are going to lead this discussion. I mean, for example, we definitely advocated kind of when we were initially shut down that, there'd be consideration for things like housing construction and affordable housing construction to continue. You tend to have, distances, or you can manage the distances between people working on those projects. But, at some point the health department comes in and kind of overrides those asks. And I think they're going to be the ones that kind of lead this discussion and give the broad parameters. I think it's not going to be probably the most specific on how things work, but there'll be notions like we want to maintain social distancing, and then how you go about doing that in a specific office space, will be the issue.
So to add to that question, another anonymous question that we received, and bear with me if this is in a different purview, but would this be up to the landlord or the tenant to enforce these types of physical distancing guidelines?
I would imagine a combination of both, but I imagine the tenant is kind of more responsible for the internal space and kind of what works. But I think it brings up these questions about, okay, well, if there can't be as many people in a space as there once was, what does that do to the rent or the lease?
Yeah.
Which will be definitely individual discussions between landlords and tenants.
Yeah. How would you propose, and this is from Renew, how would you propose regional transit agencies, especially those with large amounts of land, play a role in the region going forward with aspects such as affordable housing and expanding public space for commercial use?
Yeah, I think those are huge opportunities for housing, especially affordable housing. I mean, typically when in San Francisco, when there's an opportunity to build new housing, like the Balboa Reservoir that we're dealing with currently and will likely be approved at least by the Planning Commission at the end of this month, a public asset. It was a reservoir down by City College on Ocean Avenue, never used as I don't think it ever had a drop of water in it, but was built by our PUC to be a backup reservoir, but a great opportunity to convert to housing. In these cases, we try to maximize the amount of affordable housing. In this case, it's 50% affordable and 50% market rate. But to me, that's a great project. It's kind of a great win. It's in a neighborhood we're not necessarily building a ton of new housing, huge component of affordable housing. So I think that's the model that's got to be used in publicly owned land throughout, whether it's transit agency owns it, or it's Caltrans, or it's our SFPUC. And I think Assemblymember Chu has pushed on BART and others to use their parking lots, for better use than just parking lots, with housing perhaps above parking and above commercial uses.
We actually got a number of questions asking about that transit. Here's a good one actually. Do you see ground floors of buildings turning into office space when retailers are not able to come back?
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily the ideal use for ground floor space. I think part of the character of San Francisco is kind of these active ground floors, especially in neighborhood commercial corridors and especially downtown. So, you want that active, transparent space. It is great walking in San Francisco because you have that.
Yeah.
So office may not be, maybe in limited cases, perhaps if there's the ability to kind of have preference for nonprofit office spaces. We're talking about that along commercial corridors. Again, I don't think we realize retail there are issues with retail in sustaining the amount of ground floor commercial space we have currently. So some of those principles are going to have to give in order to keep those ground floor spaces filled.
Here's another good question. So most construction came to a halt during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So how has this set us back in terms of our construction timeline?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's a tremendous setback. So housing with a significant affordable housing component was never stopped. So if you had a major housing project, and I think at the time, if it had an affordable housing component of like over 10%, it was able to continue. Those rules got adjusted as time went on, and that percentage of housing or affordable housing kind of was tweaked. And then the recent order allowed all construction to continue. So we're seeing, not a tremendous kind of impact on ongoing construction. I think new projects that could have been coming out of the chute now, that's where we're going to, see an impact. We're mostly fee driven, our department, and to give you kind of an example, we kind of anticipate about $40 million in fees every year. Our finance folks are projecting about a $6 million reduction during these kind of months where we're shut down. Our fiscal year ends June 30th, so it's a big hit. It's over 10%. Some of it's just because we stopped taking new applications for 3 weeks or so. We're back taking all applications with the building department also. So hopefully there's that kind of pent up demand and people continue with that, but it's not gonna, we're not gonna meet our revenue targets.
All right, let's see. What else do we have? We got time for a couple more questions if anybody wants to submit. Okay, this is an interesting one. Does the planning department have a model or matrix to keep office building and housing balanced?
Yeah.
I think,
Well,
yeah.
it's a good question. I mean, generally zoning kind of keeps that balance. Office tends to be limited to downtown and south of Market in other areas like Mission Bay and Pier 70, and then housing preferred where office not allowed in most other places in the city. So the zoning kind of provides that balance. Whether developers build to that is a question. I think we've been seeing more office construction just based by the kind of the jobs we've created and the housing units we've created compared to residential in the last couple of years. I think that was the motivation for Prop E that was passed, that even further limits office development. In frankly, that initiative will pretty much stymie any new office construction in the next 5 years or so, because the balance that we're allowed to kind of spend for office construction will be negative to the tune of like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of square feet of office space. And so until we build the amount of housing to kind of bring that positive, the voters have said we can't build new office space. We think that's a short-sighted. It's kind of trying to solve our housing crisis by stopping office construction, where I firmly believe we need to solve our housing crisis by building more housing, finding new revenue sources for affordable housing, doing it at the regional level. But the voters kind of disagreed. So, we have that proposition, which will make it a challenge to build any new office space, unless you've already been entitled, like the projects in Central Soma or on some of the port properties.
So we have a good chunk of people on right now. I would love to kind of end this conversation with some action items. And, you're the head of planning now, you were part of the planning commission before. I would love to know how you think these employees should get involved at, helping recreate the vibrant or, improving upon San Francisco, making it a better place to live and work. What can they do? What would you recommend?
I mean, one, ideas. I think, the city leaders are looking for ideas on what to do coming out of this pandemic. In some of the restaurant ideas we talked about here came from a couple of architects and designers who are involved in the restaurant industry, and they got traction and kind of moved along. So, your thoughts on where we're going and kind of how we recover from the pandemic, I think, is critical. And then just getting involved in kind of the broader debate about where the city goes, especially on housing issues. It tends to be, polarized, the discussion. Either we need to build a ton more housing or we shouldn't change anything and build no housing. I think it tends to be a little more nuanced than that. We've got to build the right supply of housing. We've got to build it in the right places. We've got to build a significant amount of affordable housing. We've got to protect vulnerable communities in San Francisco and try to combat gentrification in neighborhoods. But we clearly need housing, and getting involved in that debate, I think is a great place to try to make change. We're seeing it happen. There's a lot more people involved in that discussion than there had been a decade ago.
Yeah, we had the CIO on a few weeks back, and she said that civic participation is way up now that the meetings have gone virtual.
Yeah, no, it'll be interesting to see if that continues, the virtual hearings and allowing people to call in and give their public opinion that way. But I know from sitting on the commission, even emails when there's not a hearing or emails about an item before the hearing help. you know,
Yep.
they're considered by commissioners and listen to them, especially if they're thoughtful and not kind of just, you know, a standard email that's kind of a form email.
Yeah. All right. Well, everybody's got their to-dos. Also, we are sf.citi, so I'm going to remind you, make sure you're registered to vote. November is going to be a big election with a full San Francisco ballot too. So vote down ballot. So many people are not paying attention to local issues. And this is, you know, as Rich has told us, so many things that affect your quality of life they're decided right here at the city level. All right. Well, Rich, it's been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to end with one quick question for you. Where are you most looking forward to eating when shelter in place is lifted?
That's a good question. I mean, I've definitely been taking advantage of a lot of restaurants that have offered to go, but Bar Crudo, I live near Divisadero. Bar Crudo had a great happy hour. So they're closed and not offering to go options. So I'm looking forward to getting back there.
Nice. Great recommendation. Thanks for your time, Rich. We will see you all in a few weeks.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Everybody.
Take care.
See ya.